So today we're going to look at the 4 biological molecules that we have. But first of all, what are actually these biological molecules? So biological molecules are organic molecules. And organic molecules have a few characteristics that are important. For one, they contain carbon, which is one of the very important elements. And on the other hand, they are also found in the body. So these are 2 important characteristics of biological molecules. Now, there's 4 different types of biological molecules. We'll start to list them, and I'll use 4 different colors for each of them. So the first one is carbohydrates. Then the second one are lipids. In yellow we'll put them. Third one is proteins. And last but not least, we have the nucleic acids in red. Now what's important for all of them is that they consist of different molecules. So as we already said, we definitely have carbon for all of them. Another 2 elements that are always present are hydrogen and oxygen. And for carbohydrates, there's the standard formula, which looks like this. So there's 2 hydrogen molecules in each possible combination. For example, C6H12O6, that's glucose. So there's twice as many hydrogens as there are carbons and oxygens. In lipids, there's 3 molecules and less oxygen. So mainly it's carbon and hydrogen in chains. Proteins also have nitrogens and sometimes sulfur. So S for sometimes sulfur. And nucleic acids also have nitrogen and phosphate. So these are the elements, the biochemical elements that are there in these organic molecules. And another thing that's important for all 4 of them is the building principle. Building principle. And this is because large molecules consist of smaller molecules. The smaller molecules are called monomers, because mono means 1. And these are the building blocks. Building blocks are also just the simple molecules. And these monomers can be made into polymers. Poly means multiple. So for example, if we have one monomer, let's just say this square, and a bunch of these together, linked together, makes complex, larger molecules, which are called polymers. This is an example, simplified version. Yeah. And now to the next part, which is the monomers of each of these molecules. So for carbohydrates, the monomers, I'll write that on the side. Monomers. So the building blocks of carbohydrates that they consist of are called monosaccharides. Again, we have the word mono, which stands for 1, and saccharides means sugars. In simple words, they're also called simple sugars. For lipids, it has different building blocks, and 2 of the main ones are glycerol and fatty acids. proteins consist of different amino acids, and there are a total of 20 different amino acids which can be combined together to make complex proteins. And the nucleic acids consist of nucleotides. Now, what are some examples of these monomers and polymers that they make? So for carbohydrates, maybe one you've already heard of is glucose. This molecule here is also the chemical formula of glucose, and glucose is one of the monomers. So glucose can be put together to make disaccharide, for example. So for carbohydrates, monosaccharides make monosaccharide, which is, for example, glucose, makes disaccharides if you put two of them together. And then lots of monosaccharides or disaccharides. So if there's more than two, it makes polysaccharides. And an example of a disaccharide is two glucose molecules together. Oops, sorry about that. Which makes, for example, maltose. And a bunch of different glucose molecules together, which can be put together in different ways. An example for that is starch. And there's also different types of monosaccharides. For example, there's also fructose, and if you put, for example, glucose, which is a monomer, plus fructose, so these are two monosaccharides, which make together a disaccharide, and in this case, this disaccharide would be called sucrose. So these are details which I'll talk to you more about in later videos. This is the intro to the 4 biological molecules. And now let's look at some examples for lipids. So we've got the monomers, glycerol, and fatty acids. And if we put, so for example, one glycerol molecule, I'm just simplifying this and just making a box. And so we're having glycerol just as this. There's a chemical formula, but we'll just, for simplified reasons. And fatty acids are mostly chains. So if we have, for example, one glycerol molecule and 3 fatty acids, like this makes triacetylglycerol, which is shortened as TAG. This is a very important lipid, which is used, for example, in lipid storage, in fat tissue. And another example is if we put glycerol together with 2 fatty acids and with a phosphate group, then this would make a phospholipid. And phospholipids are, for example, very important in cell membranes. Okay, and now we come to proteins. Some examples of proteins. Some examples of amino acids. So there's 20 main amino acids, and we'll talk about them more later, but these are some examples: glycine and lysine, for example. And they can make a bunch of different proteins if different amino acids are put together. And proteins are, for example, there's many hormones that are proteins, and antibodies are also proteins. Yeah, these are just some examples to keep in mind. And nucleotides, or nucleic acids. For the nucleotides, there are 4 different types in DNA. So the 2 main examples of nucleic acid are DNA and RNA, which is the genetic material. And their building blocks, so their monomers, are the nucleotides. And for the nucleotides, there are 4 or 5 different ones. So DNA has 4 different ones. It's A, T, G, C. They're shortened like this. And this stands for, A stands for adenosine, T stands for thymine, G stands for guanine, and C stands for cytosine. And in RNA, there's a different one. So there's no thymine in RNA. Instead, there's uracil. And in DNA, as the same as there's no uracil, there's thymine. And the other 3 are also the same in RNA. Now, and for the last part, we're going to look at some functions of the 4 different biomolecules. So, functions in the body. So starting again with carbohydrates, one very important function is source of energy. So glucose is used as the main source of energy in the body, and carbohydrates are also important for short-term storage of energy. And the short-term storage is mostly in glycogen, which can be then broken down to glucose. Energy storage. Another function of carbohydrates is also structural components, but the main function is the source of energy. And structural components, an example of that is cellulose. That's another carbohydrate, which is found in plants, and that, for us humans, is then dietary fiber in plants when we eat them. Then, for the functions of lipids, I'll erase this so we have more space. So, for lipids, they are also a source of energy. But the difference with lipids is that they are a source of long-term energy. So, fats can be stored, for example, as TAG in the fat tissue, and that can be used if energy levels of glucose are very low, and then fat would be used as the next source of energy. Fat is also important as isolation, which is more for evolutionary purposes. And another function of lipids are structural components. We've talked about that a bit already. For example, the phospholipids. That was an example of one of the lipids, and phospholipids are important for cell membranes. They're one of the components of cell membranes. Then lipids are also used as signaling molecules. And there's also some hormones, which are called steroid hormones, which consist of lipids. And then next to proteins. So proteins have a large variety, which means they also have lots of functions. I'll just give you some examples. There's more details coming on each of the biological molecules, but some examples that are very important are that we also mentioned. Many hormones are proteohormones, which consist of made of proteins. Also antibodies. Antibodies are important for the immune system. Another example is enzymes, which are also very important in the body because they catalyze all the reactions that happen. Then proteins are also within the cell membrane because there's membrane proteins. Membrane proteins can act as channels, for example, or as receptors. Then another function is muscle contraction. The proteins in the muscles are mainly two of them, which are called actin and myosin. These are another two examples for proteins. And another function is also for the structure. So proteins are also structural components. And an example of that is collagen. Maybe you've heard of it before. This is also a protein. I'll give you two more examples and then we'll leave the proteins as they are. So for transport, for example, proteins are important. An example of transport is in the blood. There's hemoglobin, which, whoops, I don't know what just happened. Hemoglobin, which transports oxygen in the blood. And the last example for today is blood clotting. In blood clotting, there's plasma proteins involved. Plasma proteins, which as the name says are also proteins that aid when there is a wound. And now lastly back to the nucleotides. So as we've already mentioned, the nucleotides, the nucleic acids are mainly DNA and RNA. And the function of these two is that they contain genetic information. And this genetic information is important for all the traits that you have and also gets passed on later when we have offspring. So yeah, that's a first overview of the 4 biological molecules, and make sure to watch the next videos when they're out.